All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to tackle one of the biggest, most complicated topics of the 20th century, the Cold War. It was this massive 45-year global rivalry that honestly shaped the very world we're all living in right now. So let's just jump right in.
Okay, so first things first, let's talk about that name, the Cold War. Why cold? I mean, it sounds kind of weird for a conflict that was defined by so much fear and tension, doesn't it?
Well, the simple answer is that it was cold because the two main players, the United States and the Soviet Union, never actually went to a direct, all-out hot war with each other. So instead of armies clashing on a battlefield, it was more like this giant global chess match. A high-stakes game fought with politics, with money, and with a whole lot of propaganda.
And you know, the term itself has a pretty amazing origin. It comes from the writer George Orwell. And get this, in 1945, right as the atomic age was dawning, he basically predicted this future, a world locked in a nuclear stalemate, paralyzed by the fact that these new superstates could wipe each other off the map in seconds. It's pretty chilling how right he was.
So that's the what. Now, how did it all even start? You know, the end of World War II was supposed to mean peace, but instead, a whole new kind of division just slammed down across Europe, a division that would become famously known as the Iron Curtain.
You see, as soon as the common enemy was defeated, that wartime alliance between the US and the USSR just evaporated. And when you look at what each side wanted, it's easy to see why. They were on a collision course. The West was terrified of the Soviets completely taking over Eastern Europe and of communism spreading. Meanwhile, the Soviets wanted to build a protective wall of friendly countries to guard against Germany and, of course, to spread their communist ideology everywhere.
And it didn't take long. By 1948, those lines were basically drawn in concrete. America pumped huge amounts of money, the Marshall Plan, into Western Europe to rebuild and pull it firmly into the American sphere. And on the other side, the Soviets locked down Eastern Europe, installing loyal communist governments. Just like that, the continent was split right down the middle.
Okay, so now we're moving into what is honestly the scariest part of this whole story. This is the period when the conflict escalated, and the entire world really did stand on the brink of total destruction.
The sequence of events here, I mean, it happened so fast, it's almost dizzying. It kicks off with the Soviets trying to squeeze the Allies out of Berlin. In response, the West forms the NATO military alliance. Then, that same year, boom! The Soviets test their first atomic bomb, and the U.S. nuclear monopoly is over. And just a year after that, the Cold War turns hot in the first major proxy war in Korea.
And suddenly, this wasn't just about who had more soldiers. It became a frantic race to build more powerful weapons. We're talking about the hydrogen bomb, and even scarier, the missiles to deliver them anywhere in the world. ICBMs. Missiles that could fly from one continent to another in minutes. For the first time in human history, the threat of total, instant annihilation was a part of daily life.
All of that fear, all that tension, that terrifying arms race, it all came to a head. It reached its absolute breaking point in one single, fateful year, 1962.
And that, of course, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets snuck nuclear missiles into Cuba, putting them just a stone's throw from the U.S. For 13 days, the world just watched, terrified, as the superpowers went nose to nose. This was the moment the insane logic of mutual assured destruction, or MAD, became horrifyingly real. Everyone knew if one side pushed the button, both sides, and maybe the whole world, would be destroyed.
So after staring into the abyss like that, both superpowers basically realized, okay, we cannot do this again. It was just too close, too dangerous. The game had to change. The battlefield itself had to shift.
Since they couldn't fight each other directly, they started fighting through other countries. These were the infamous proxy wars. You see it here on both sides. The Soviets would send in tanks to crush uprisings in places like Hungary and Czechoslovakia to keep them in line. And the US was busy too, backing coups or fighting long, draining wars like in Vietnam, all in the name of stopping communism from spread.
But at the same time, that simple black and white, two-sided world was starting to get, well, a lot more complicated. The communist world wasn't a single united bloc anymore. China and the Soviet Union had a massive falling out. Meanwhile, Western Europe and Japan were becoming huge economic powers themselves. This simple two-player game, was over.
And all this new complexity actually led to a bit of a thaw. A period in the 1970s we called détente, which is just a fancy French word for an easing of tensions. For the first time, the two sides actually sat down to negotiate limits on their nuclear arsenals, with treaties like SALT I and SALT II. It was a step back from the brink.
But you know, the Cold War didn't just fizzle out. Its end was sudden, dramatic, and it took almost everyone completely by surprise. This is the final act of the story. The moment the wall came tumbling down.
And the person at the absolute center of it all was the last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. He brought in these huge radical reforms. Now, he wasn't trying to destroy the Soviet Union. Actually, he was trying to save it. He thought that by making it more open and democratic, he could fix its deep, deep problems.
But what he actually did was unleash a chain reaction that nobody could stop. It was like dominoes falling, but in reverse. First, one by one, the communist governments across Eastern Europe just collapsed. Then, the biggest symbol of all, the Berlin Wall, comes crashing down. Germany is reunified. And you can just feel the power draining away from Moscow. The center just couldn't hold anymore.
And then, the final, almost unbelievable act. By the end of 1991, the Soviet Union itself was just gone. It officially voted itself out of existence. And just like that, after 45 years, the Cold War was over.
So yes, the Cold War officially ended. But think about it. The alliances it built, the rivalries it deepened, the very lines on the map, so much of that architecture is still with us today. It leaves us with one last big question to think about. Has the world order that the Cold War created ever really gone away? That's all for this explainer. Thanks for joining.